I'm Jim Collison, and live from our virtual studios around the world. This is Gallup's Called to Coach, recorded on May 22nd, 2020. Called to Coach is a resource for those who want to help others discover and use their strengths. We have Gallup experts and independent strengths coaches share tactics, insights, and strategies to help coaches maximize the talent of individuals, teams, and organizations around the world. If you're listening live, love to have you join us on our chat room. There's a link right above me on the live page. Just sign in there. We'll take your questions during the program. If you're listening after the fact and you have any questions, you can send us an email, coaching@gallup.com. If you're there on YouTube watching us, don't forget to subscribe down below there. There's a subscription button. Allow you to get notifications whenever we go live. And if you want to listen to it as a podcast, just on any podcast app, search Gallup Webcast, and we are there. Mara Hoogerhuis is our host today. She's a Gallup Subject Matter Expert in Leadership, Learning, and Change. And Mara, great to have you on Called to Coach, and welcome back.
Thank you so much.
Mara, we spent the first half of this session today kind of talking about resiliency and strengths. We talked about it from an individual perspective. How can we own that as individuals? We talked about it from an organizational perspective and gave some advice to managers on things they can do to kind of help their organization thrive during these times of change. If you're coming to this session first, I invite you to go back. It's going to kind of set the baseline for what we're talking about. Here in this session, you're going to kind of lead us through this idea of, okay, so how do I actually do this? Mm-hmm. How does this actually get done? So give us some tips and advice, and let's just kind of start. Where do we start with this? So I'm ready to do it. Where do we get started?
So the first place I often think about is mindset. And I know, there's a lot of conversation and research around mindsets these days. And I guess what I'd ask you to reflect on first is, when you think about change, what comes to mind? What are you thinking about? Typically, when organizations or leaders are asking me to help them think about how they lead through change, it's kind of a negative, right? Like, this is being done to us. How do I get the most out of it, et cetera? And I think there's an opportunity to think differently. When I think about change, there's different words that come to mind that help me get in that mindset. Words like adaptation, evolution, transformation, growth, transition, metamorphosis. I think that frames change in a bigger context, right? If you don't change, you might die, from a real evolutionary, like biological standpoint. And I think it starts to look at changes about new beginnings, new openings, going forward. And that lens, I think, certainly puts me in a more positive and puts my clients in a more positive mindset around change. But it also helps as a strategy to get beyond what's being done and done to you, to see how the pieces fit together, to get a little clearer on your why. And to see how change is something that can be anticipated and an expected part of work life and also personal life. Change is not episodic. I also think we tend to imagine change as something that's going to be done. There's a start and an end. And maybe there are some starts and some ends. You're rolling out a new technology platform or something. But for the most part, change is going to be an ongoing, recurring pattern in our lives. And I think it's speeding up. So what we want to be thinking about now is, rather than trying to manage change, to minimize the disruption of change, to get our arms around it and like wrestle it to the ground and tell it how we want it to happen, we probably need to think more about leading change, about unleashing the opportunity for change to happen across the organization, and allowing more initiating of change to happen throughout the organization.
Yeah. Do you have an example as we kind of think about changes that have gone on? And it's always easy to look in the past and say, but what would be a great example of an organization maybe that change happened and it didn't evolve to meet the change? Yeah,
that's right. Jim, when was the last time you bought film for your camera?
It's been a long time.
Yeah. So Kodak Eastman, I think, is a great example. There's a famous story, that Kodak saw some of the advent of digital photography and technology coming, but said digital will never take the place of film. And so we're not going to get into that business. We're not going to go there. Kodak Eastman doesn't exist as a company anymore. So I think there's that idea of the dilemma of the innovator, or this notion that because we're the first to do something, we don't have to change, or we know better than the market. But consumer behaviors are changing. Technology is changing. The generations in the workplace is changing. There's so much happening that I think it's a little bit. It's not humble to assume you don't have to change too. It's all evolving, and we've got to evolve with it.
Yeah, and of course, it's always easy. Hindsight is 2020, and it's always easy to look back when you're in the middle of those things. It's particularly hard. Like, they thought they were right. There's a lot of organizations that haven't adapted or haven't changed in the time they thought they were right. So we're going to spend some time maybe sifting through that. It's May 2020 as we record this, and of course we're in the middle of COVID and a pandemic here around the world. I remember when this 10 weeks ago, and really 12 weeks ago, when we really started thinking about what the new world was going to look like from a remote worker standpoint of sending everybody home. I remember having this thought: okay, I can't stop this from happening. How can I take advantage of it to make sure I'm I'm in the best possible situation from a work standpoint as I can be? How can I use my own strengths? How can I use what I'm good at? How can I use the equipment that's around me, materials and equipment, right, to really take advantage of this? Because we know teams are made up of individuals, and it really all starts at an individual level. So walk us through a little bit. Where do you focus, and how do we start with the individual first?
Change is personal, and I think the irony of change is that it starts at the individual level. Organizations are made up of individuals, so as we start to think about how we shift organizations or respond to change, even adjusting to smaller changes inside of our own team, we've got to start by thinking about the individual. And I think this is the error that most organizations make, is they over-index on thinking and planning around the technology, the systems, and the process by which they want to enact change. And they underestimate the time and energy it takes to really shift culture and people and bring them along. And that might be why 70% of organizational change initiatives fail. So if we zero in and think about any change through the lens of how we're going to move heads, hearts, and hands, I think we'll be more successful. Gallup certainly knows a lot about behavioral economics, the connection to feelings and how much feelings drive our energy and decisions in the workplace. And that's what we need in order to make change happen. So I think you want to tap into what individuals need, the mindset, skill sets, and tool sets that they need to move along with the change. And a few highlights of kind of what we know some places are that you might want to narrow into are connected to engagement. So we know when there's change in the workplace, big or small, people lose sight of maybe what their priorities are, what their expectations are, their roles and responsibilities. So that's something that managers could start talking about right away when you know a change is happening, is re-clarifying. We know people struggle with tools and technology and the materials and equipment to do their work right. And that can create a lot of stress. I mean, I don't know about you, but thinking about all of the people who are having to have new technology working from home and then do their job, that created a lot of stress. The organizations that were listening to that and then mitigating that undue stress just from technology issues are going to be better off in leading change. We talked a lot yesterday in our previous session about opportunities. Feels like yesterday. What is a day anymore? We talked a lot about opportunities to do what I do best. And I think, again, helping position people to take advantage of what they bring, to give them energy to develop through change is powerful. We know certainly that people feel less connected sometimes, or lose sight of the mission when they're going through a lot of change on their team or in their organization. So I think managers being really thoughtful about connecting the dots between what we're doing now and why is a strategy in leading individuals through change. And then lastly, we're all in this together, that kind of mentality, and there's no room for slack when we need everybody's kind of game face and discretionary effort to create change. And so I think, helping connect the dots that all teams are essential. How are you being a partner to your internal teams during change? Those are all strategies that can help managers kind of be attuned to the needs we have in the workplace, and particularly those 5 needs that typically are most impacted when we move people's cheese.
Mara, you did a great job there. You didn't say it, but you walked us through Q1, 2, and 3, 8, and 9 on the Q12. And oftentimes we look at that Q12 assessment as some people see it as punitive. In other words, what am I doing wrong? And I've seen this. We've used it at Gallup during the 08, 09 financial debacle around the world. We actually implemented the Q12 4 times that year. Each quarter, we measure ourselves, right, to determine how are we feeling about this. And so when you're thinking about rapid change and you're thinking, I used to go to work and now I'm home. What's expected of me, right? Q1, what's expected of me? 2, when I came home, did I have the right materials and equipment to do my job, right? For you, it might be, oh my gosh, everybody's online now. Have my expectations changed? I used to operate with a certain set of rules when everybody was in the office, but now, let me ask you that question. This is totally unscripted and off, but when Gallup came home, right, most of us went home, and we lost some folks in the process as well. Did things change for you? Did you see a difference in the way the organization worked? And was that stressful because the rules changed a little bit?
I definitely saw a change in the way the organization worked, in terms of kind of speed and agility. I think a lot of organizations, Gallup included, have experienced some redeploying of talent, and that definitely has shifted kind of what I do every day, the tools, the people I work with, and I think that's something we saw as well that kind of connects back to these needs in the workplace.
It's just an interesting thought. We always come from our perspective, but from our folks who already are remote, what kind of stress did we should be asking you those questions, just like I asked you, like, hey, how has your world changed now that we're operating a little bit differently? Because the majority of us are now working differently. Could have a total effect on you. I also think this question about, are my coworkers committed to quality work, is really, really important in change, because what happens in change sometimes is people start thinking like, well, I'm pulling my weight, but I'm not sure my coworkers are, right? And it gives managers this clue into knowing if that quality work component begins to drop, we have a potential for really bad chemistry to start happening, and maybe misaligned strengths fits in there. Do you have anything you'd add to that?
Well, maybe just pulling out, you're talking about using engagement as a metric to kind of track how people are feeling through a change. And that could certainly be a powerful feedback and loop, to kind of listen to what people need and make adjustments. I also think you could use data on the front end to see how change ready your culture is, because we definitely have seen how highly engaged cultures are more resilient during times of change and actually perform even better than their peers during times of disruption and crisis. So, numbers and tracking can really help us both understand the readiness to get as we begin, and help us understand adoption and impact throughout the process as well.
Yeah, and it may not always mean a decrease in engagement, right? We may see, when I was in the military and during peacetime, that's the worst, like, engagement is at an all-time low. It's not, the teams aren't functioning like what they're built for. And I was in the military during the first Gulf War, and when we got deployed for that, I saw an organization work like I'd never seen it work before. I actually kind of think too, here is just during this time, I've seen teams where the engagement has really picked up.
Yeah.
But
just to highlight that, when the organizations that have been measuring engagement throughout this time, we've seen that as well, that the organizational levels of engagement are higher than ever before. And I actually think there's a clue there when you think about leading change. why during this time is it higher? And it's because it's kind of an all hands on deck mentality. We're all pulling together. It's because there's a clear, united purpose that we're all reacting to and responding to. It's because there's more communication than ever before. And I mean, Gallup's been talking about this for a long time, right? One of the biggest levers we have in engagement and performance, and also in leading change, is by shifting the nature of the conversations we have every day. And the conversations that my clients have been having have been much more about providing clarity, confidence, compassion for people, and that's made a really meaningful difference. So I think those are things we could bring into any strategy we have going forward when we're navigating change.
Any other tips as we think, managers have to lead this change with people? And if you kind of mentioned the communication, I think it's imperative that we communicate more, right? And purposefully, not communicate to just communicate's sake. I'm going to set a reminder to send an email to my team every Monday. Not kind of that, but that purposeful communication. Anything else you would add to that?
I would just double down on feedback. So, we're talking about how you lead change, that organizational change begins with individual change. And so as a manager, providing meaningful feedback is the way to give your folks more agency during the change. I think those conversations can be focused on what can they contribute to this, so that people don't feel like it's being done to them. I think those conversations could be grounded in how can you develop through this, right? What do you want to learn from this? And I think those conversations can be future oriented and positive in nature. So it's, how can we, where do we want to go? So more visioning and more of a strengths-based lens on how we use what we've got to navigate this can be really important.
Yeah, I think that strength-based lens and inventory of what I have, if I'm a manager and I'm in crisis, and I haven't taken a strengths inventory of my team. What do I have with me? I might find I have all the components I need to lead through change and the people I have. I just didn't know I had it. Mm-hmm. And so a great opportunity to lead your team by taking the inventory. What are they great at? And not just having them take the CliftonStrengths assessment and get some words back, but some actual conversations. We spent some time with Paul and Al Winsman talking about the 5 coaching conversations, of having some real conversations with your folks, of saying, hey, where do you think you could be utilized more? This could be a great opportunity. Okay, so as we think, as we move up to an organizational level, as we kind of wrap this, where would we start organizationally? What are some tips some organizations can do to really kind of think or double down? I'll use your words, to double down on this.
Where you were going, I want to expand on kind of a strengths inventory is, a great tactic for what I would say is the strategy of broadening involvement. So going back to the different words I use to describe and conceive of change: evolution, adaptation, transformation, metamorphosis, those words in many ways speak to the world, biology, animals, life. And so I think about ecosystems a lot when I think about helping leaders and organizations go through change. We are all in an organizational ecosystem. One change in one part of the organization creates a lasting, issue in another part. It's all interrelated. And so I think where you might start if you're wanting to lead a change is by trying to involve more people in your thinking and in your plan. So I believe the answer is in the room. So expand the room. Get cross-functional partners together. Talk about the unintended consequences and the implications. Talk about what happens if everything works beautifully and the downstream consequences that you probably need to plan for. Just get more visibility. What I'd like to buck is this notion that change is designed at the top and it's rolled out to everybody else, because then I think we have a limited view of change. And so what I'd rather encourage is, it's not about designing the plan and rolling out messages. It's about building more messengers. And so, understanding who your stakeholders are, understanding how the organization is kind of interrelated, and involving more people in the plan. the planning process is really important. It's going to get their buy-in. It's going to reduce a lot of, unforced errors, and it's probably going to allow people to move more quickly as well.
Mara, we spent a lot of time talking about some advice around when change is, I think the assumption we made is when change is forced on organizations. What about organizations where change becomes, and Justin just asked this question in the chat room, but I think it's applicable. What about change for change's sake? Sometimes organizations, just because it's the new hottest thing to do, just because it's, not saying the agile methodology is not the latest hot topic, right? Whatever. But as we think about organizations changing and just to jump on the latest bandwagon, do we have any thoughts kind of around that when the change is maybe not healthy for the organization on that side? How can managers or individuals approach that?
I think it's not healthy when it's been derived from a myopic place. Kind of going back to that idea of if there's, people in a dark room pulling the strings, it's always going to feel like it's not connected to a big why. It's always going to feel like it's being done to us. And I guess I'd go back to this mindset of, change is necessary. Figuring out the right changes is something we need to broaden involvement around. So we reduce some of this downstream resistance that people might say, well, I don't see why. This just feels like change for change's sake. If that's something you're hearing in your organization, that's probably a clue that we need to do some better connecting of the dots for people. I'd actually see that as a red flag.
Yeah, and maybe in a sense, it causes us to question: do we have people in the right places? If they're not seeing that change as necessary or needed, or there's lots of resistance there, I think there's some great questions you can ask as a manager of why. Oftentimes we just say, "We're doing this, put up with it." You just have to deal with it. When it's like, why? Tell me more about that. Tell me why you think it's a bad idea, and let's dialogue about this. And maybe there's some clues that maybe we don't have you aligned properly inside the organization, and there's another role that fits you better from that standpoint, or adapting or adjusting their job responsibilities to have it make sense from that. Mara, anything else you'd add before we wrap this up?
Maybe just a real down and dirty quick tip. Then think about who your stakeholders are and create a stakeholder map. You talked about an inventory of strengths on your team. That works both for an intact, but also expand it to cross-functional partners. Where are those dependencies? Because again, if we think about an organization as an ecosystem and change as an evolution, then we want to figure out where the dependencies are so that we can cover all of our bases. So I think you could just do a quick stakeholder map and start thinking about it, and then engage people in conversations. I think the biggest mistake we make as leaders is trying to figure it out on our own, because we see the value we bring as the decider, and the planner. And I would just say, actually, the value you bring is maybe in bringing groups of people together to decide and plan.
That's great advice. With that, we'll remind everyone to take full advantages of all the resources we have available. Again, we've got through this Building Cultures That Inspire series, we've got some great sessions on this as we've been working through communication and recognition and strengths, name it, claim it, and aim it, which we covered in the very first session. So those are available for you at gallup.com/CliftonStrengths. You can, while you're there, sign up for our Clifton Strengths community newsletter. That way you can always stay up to date on all the things that are happening here, and you can always be in the know, because that's what people really want, Mara, is to be in the know, right? They just don't want to be left out of the decision.
Me.
That's right. Let me know. Communicate with me. We do that. We do that as well. If you have any questions, you can send us an email, coaching@gallup.com. If you want to join us for live sessions, you can follow that over at gallup.eventbrite.com. And if you're interested in joining us on social, you can go to facebook.com/groups/call-to-coach. On LinkedIn, maybe you're not a Facebooker, and on LinkedIn, you can head over to Clifton Strengths Train Coaches, and that will let you in that group as well. I want to thank you for joining us today. Mara, thank you for spending time with us over these last two, and we'll look forward to having you back again. If you're listening live, stay around. I've got a couple questions for the post show. With that, we'll say goodbye, everybody.